Good evening. Welcome to Global Dialogue, a program dedicated to an understanding of global events and activities from the local point of view, from a local participant's point of view. Tonight, my guest is Professor Mayfair Yang. Professor Yang is the director of the Confucius Institute at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Now, it might be a little strange, I think, for us to hear that there is a Confucius Institute at the university. Wouldn't it be more appropriate to have that institute somewhere in China?
Well, the Confucius Institute there is a phenomenon of the past 12, 14 years or so, and it's funded by the Chinese government Ministry of Education, and there are about over 400 Confucius Institutes around the world, in almost every country of the world, it serves to promote the understanding and the study of Chinese culture, history, and society. So we have one now at UC Santa Barbara, and so one of our roles is to promote the learning of Chinese language. So we have a Chinese language instructor sent to us to be integrated into our existing Chinese language program at UC Santa Barbara in the East Asian Languages and Cultural Studies Department.
So this is a Chinese instructor who's sent from China, by China.
Correct. She's from Shandong University, which is our partner university in China.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting. Now, the Chinese government is the sponsor of this event, and so why do you think they want to put forward the name Confucius?
Okay, so Confucius is an ancient sage who lived in the 6th century BCE, and he's had a tremendous impact over so much of Chinese history, the last 2,000 years. Now, he hit upon some hard times in the modern era, beginning with the May 4th movement of 1919, when new educated elites in urban areas of China started questioning that huge, long cultural heritage of traditional Chinese thinking. And Confucius being so prominent, being a part of state orthodoxy since the late imperial era, even going back to the Han Dynasty, which is contemporary with Roman times, he became a big target beginning in the early 20th century, all the way to the the criticized Lin Biao criticized Confucius campaign of 1971 during the Maoist era.
I remember first hearing the name Confucius when I was a kid, and watching American television. This Chinese detective from Hawaii, Charlie Chan, who would always end every paragraph with a quotation from Confucius. Do you remember?
Yes, I watched. I came to the U.S. in 1972, so I missed a lot of Charlie Chan episodes.
Yes, you did.
I've watched a few. There's, in the old days, people could recite the Confucian classics because much of their education was memorizing the classics.
Yeah.
And so Confucian wisdom and philosophy was in the minds of even ordinary people.
Why should we remember Confucius? What was, if it could be specified briefly, what was his contribution to Chinese civilization?
So today, why he's making a comeback is not just because the government supports it, but ordinary Chinese people want to revisit and reflect upon and reconnect with traditional Chinese culture. A primary reason is that Confucius said a lot of things about the importance of family. And when you have a very fast-changing society, your family is your kind of anchor. And Confucius said a lot about the importance of family, the loyalty to the family, respect for the older generation, the mutual help of the family. So that's one thing. Filial piety, xiao, is a value and a virtue that's very much emphasized. But today in China, the hierarchical element of filial piety is somewhat downplayed, because after all, China went through the Maoist era of radical egalitarianism. And in modern society, we do emphasize more equal relations, and that is the case for contemporary China too.
Can you give me an example of what Confucius said about family? How did he think the family should interact and express that loyalty?
Well, I think he emphasized the interdependence of the generations, that the younger generation should look out for the older generation's welfare and appreciate what the parents did to bring them into this world and to educate them. The other thing that Confucius really very much emphasized was education. And by education, he did not mean just book learning, but he also meant ritual. And so there was this kind of bodily component of ritual where you go through the motions of ritual and performance of etiquette, everyday etiquette, and in that way you inculcate these virtues and the consideration of others bodily into your habits, what the French philosopher theorist Pierre Bourdieu calls habitus. So he meant both ritual as well as book learning. And for example, I think about over a decade ago in the state of California, the amount of state tax money that went into education was overridden by the amount of state coffers that went into paying for the prison system. And I remember when that date occurred, I thought to myself, Confucius must be very upset, because during his lifetime, Confucius and his disciple Mencius would always stress that do not stress, solving the crime and wrongdoing of human beings. Don't rely on punishment and the law, because that's already too late, because the crime has already been committed. You should rely on preventative measures such as education.
But education included, for Confucius, it included ritual. In today's contemporary society, maybe characterized mostly by secularism, ritual tends to be rejected.
Yeah.
Why do you think ritual was so important for Confucius?
Because in ritual you have the movements of the body, you have each participant saying certain lines, and just repetition of ritual for the annually or seasonally and so forth, the bowing to the ancestors and so forth, that will inculcate a certain demeanor, a certain ethos that would generate the values, and it would be a bodily generation, a performative. And so he thought that was very important.
Now, as I recall, people who wanted to move up the social and economic and political ladder had to take examinations in China. Those were largely about Confucius and his teachings, I think.
Correct. They were, so to be any educated person, you had to learn the five classics and the 4 books, the Confucian classics. You had to commit them to memory. You had to be able to write essays, and you had 3 degrees in traditional China. Most people could get probably the 1st degree, but the 2nd and the highest degree were very difficult. And once you got these high degrees, you could be assigned office. So these were scholar officials who staffed the imperial bureaucracy.
So it was a merit-based system. That is, you took the examination, and if you did well, you were placed within the government. You had a role to play, and it was fairly safe.
Yes, it wanted to make sure that the bureaucracy was staffed by educated, learned people who had the discipline to study, and it also wanted virtuous people who could display in their essay writing and so forth that they could be good government officials who would look out for the welfare of the people. Of course, that was the ideal. You know, as always with human beings, the practice is often not so
on target.
On target. Yeah.
And if you took the examination, you failed, then what happened?
You can try again. Of course, the exams were only open to men at that time.
Okay. That brings about one of the basic criticisms of Confucius, that he was basically male-oriented, but I suppose everybody at the time was.
Well, you know, in the Confucian classics, he mainly said that men and women should have separate spheres. Women with the domestic and men in the public outside the home. He really did not make a lot of disparaging remarks. There's not that many remarks about women. There was one disparaging remark. But I think the reason why we have this notion that Confucianism is patriarchal is in the practice. So it's really not so much in the textual record. Okay? So it's in the practice that this is an all-male bureaucracy, imperial bureaucracy, staffed by male officials. You also have an intensification of Confucianism, and many modern Chinese scholars call it Confucian fundamentalism, beginning in the Ming Dynasty. And that was about 1368. So from the Ming Dynasty through to the Qing Dynasty, the last dynasty, it was kind of downhill for women. But in the earlier period, it was somewhat better for women. And today, in fact, the revival of Confucianism, you do have many women scholars involved, and in Confucian rituals, you have the participation of women in ancestor reverence rituals.
I remember visiting the Confucian forest, which is where all of, well, Confucius and all of his descendants are buried. But they're only male descendants. What happened to the female descendants?
Well, China has always been a patrilineal society where you trace descent and inheritance and your sort of family and lineage identity through the male line. Yeah. Now, that is the past. It continues to influence the present, and especially in the rural areas. But the 1979 one-child policy or birth control policy, it's not literally one child, because in the rural areas, people are allowed 2 children if the first one is a girl. Okay, so it's somewhat flexible in the countryside. So today, that birth control policy has made quite a lot of inroads into this tradition of privileging males. Because if you're a family with just a daughter or with 2 daughters, then you just have to adapt. And increasingly, what we find is that the birth control policy has resulted in increasing gender equality in China today. So big changes have occurred.
Yeah. Now, after 1949, when Mao Zedong came to power, and there were a series of campaigns, including the Great Leap Forward, and most particularly the Cultural Revolution, where Confucius went out of style, and students from Beijing University and elsewhere in the country were sent rummaging through the countryside, especially at the Confucian forest, especially where Confucius' home was?
Well, in a sense, because China, you know, modernizers in the 20th century of China felt that China had to change radically. They were in a kind of crisis and emergency situation. You had Western imperialism occupying parts of China. You had Japanese encroachment in Manchuria, in northeastern China, colonization, and full-scale invasion in 1937. So China was in a state of emergency, and they felt that China had to change very quickly. There wasn't the luxury of sitting back and debating and how should we modernize, how should we deal with threats from the West and Japan. They had to act. And of course, they went overboard. And I think most people in China recognize that. And that's why now that China is increasingly more materially prosperous, the people have the time to catch their breath and reflect upon the past experiences of the 20th century. And many people want to reconnect with traditional Chinese culture. So and not just Confucianism, but also Buddhism, Taoism, and in the countryside, popular religion. So all this is going on in China today.
This transformation then, the need for transformation, is what for Mao must have justified the complete rejection of the old and in with the new, something like that.
Yes. Yeah. At the time, there wasn't the luxury of, debate and scholarly study.
Right.
It was action, and quick action. And in hindsight, people can debate about what was done right and what was done wrong.
Well, let's not do that here.
No.
Let's instead turn to something else you just said, that there's also interest in Buddhism and Taoism. What is the role of these philosophies today in China?
Well, there's a great interest in Buddhism because Buddhism has such a rich heritage of scriptures and debates amongst monks, and also ritual practices and popular festivals. So at all different levels of society, of different walks of life, there's engagement in Buddhism, including scholarly engagement with Buddhist philosophy. Of course, Buddhism offers a means of transcending our temporal life, our material pursuits, because Buddhism has a lot to say about human desires, whether sexual or material desire or desire for fame. And it seeks to allow us to transcend these desires, not to get so attached to these things of our lifetime, which from the point of view of Buddhism, which takes the whole universe into perspective, our lifetimes is just a tiny blip in the universe. Why cling on to these desires that make us so unhappy? Because most of us can't fully realize our desires run away with us, and it's very unrealistic to just pursue that to no end. We should take time to disconnect ourselves from these material attachments.
And yet today, the Chinese economy is very consumer-oriented.
Yes,
how does that
and
mesh?
you'd be surprised because a lot of these very wealthy entrepreneurs and businessmen in China today, they're increasingly interested in Tibetan Buddhism because they've got it all and they still feel that there's something missing in their life. There's something empty there. And they go in search of spiritual pursuits.
And do they find it?
Well, they're engaged in the pursuit. Sometimes they take up with Tibetan lamas as their personal guru. And many people also find gratification in giving away part of their wealth, in making donations to build Buddhist temples or Taoist temples. There are people who also get enamored of Taoist teachings.
Tell us something about Taoism that we may not know.
Taoism believes it's different from Confucianism in that it's not into pursuing morality, establishing right or wrong, because Taoism adopts a perspective of nature. In the state of nature, which it calls Tao, the way, it's beyond good and evil, right and wrong. And so humanity sets up these binary categories and tries to live by them, but from the point of view of Taoism, nature is beyond that. And nature has its own rhythms and flows, and it's better for human societies to try to imitate and conform to the pathways of nature, which is spontaneity, and operating by chance movement. And there's an idea that there's a certain rhythm in the larger cosmos that it's better not to resist, but to go with that flow and to orient human societies with that flow. So Taoism is very nature-oriented. It also believes that there is a stronger cosmic flow that human societies should conform to rather than combat and steer, you know.
How would Taoism treat contemporary environmentalism?
That is the exciting thing about Taoism, that more and more scholars are trying to link up Taoist philosophy with our important environmentalist consciousness today. So, you know, there are we see the beginnings of work to sort of globalize Taoist philosophy, link it up with, say, the transcendental movement in, you know, Henry David Thoreau, Walden Pond, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and also with Buddhist philosophy too, and also with deep ecology, new, you know,